Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Up to $26,000 per employee? They call it the 15-minute refund, but it's not a gimmick. It's for business owners who stuck it out during the pandemic. The Employee Retention Tax Credit, or ERTC. But time is running out to get started. Talk to the experts. JWC Advisors at iHeartTaxRefunds.com. Who are they? CPAs who will keep you on the right side of the IRS. So do it the right way. Go to iHeartTaxRefunds.com. That's iHeartTaxRefunds.com.
Ozcast.
Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. As our listeners may recall, in 2019, Sage International Australia won a Strategic Policy Grant Program grant from the Australian Department of Defence. Under the terms of this grant, we at Sage International Australia are to examine the strategic implications of changing dynamics and regional partnerships on major power competition in the Indo-Pacific. To this end, SIA's Head of Research and Academic Development, Professor Purnendra Jain, recently flew to India where he met with staff from the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, the IDSA. This key Indian think tank was founded in 1965 and in 2015 celebrated its 50th anniversary, with India Post commemorating this milestone by issuing a stamp in recognition of the IDSA's contribution to India's national security. Pictures of Professor Jain's time with the IDSA can be found on the SIA website. Also, Professor Jain was invited to attend the prestigious Raisina Dialogue, India's premier international gathering of heads of state, foreign ministers, and regional defence and security officials. In this episode of Strategicon, we'll be discussing Purnendra's trip to India and what his observations were about India's regional ambitions. Joining us in the studio today is co-host David Olney. Welcome back, David.
Greetings, John, and greetings, listeners.
And our erstwhile producer, Tim Whiffen. Hello, Tim.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, and on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. Purnendra, welcome back to Adelaide and welcome back to Strategicon.
Thank you, John and David and Tim. Yes, I'm very happy to be back.
Okay. Well, look, Purnendra, just to start things off, can you just give the listeners an idea of the IDSA, for instance, and your time in India generally in terms of what you observed?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I went to IDSA, and IDSA is a government-supported or Department of Defense-supported think tank, very prestigious. And it has got a large number of researchers who essentially work on defense and security related issues and security in more a kind of broader term, both traditional and non-traditional security issues. So I had a session with some of those researchers at IDSA. But apart from my interaction with IDSA researchers, I also met with a number of very well-respected, well-known strategic thinkers and writers and commentators who essentially work on India's strategic policy, who work on the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific, the kinds of issues and subjects where we are interested. So it was a very productive time, although very busy, and 3 days of the Raisina Dialogue. About 700 participants came, and there were more than 150 speakers from about 100 different countries around the world. So it represented almost all the continents in the world.
Fantastic.
For listeners' sake, Purnendra, can you give us a sense of what IDSA is like? Is it very much sort of, from interns through to, senior academics and military personnel doing stints there as researchers? What's its structure? How's it divided? Is it divided by geographical area or traditional and non-traditional? how does it sort of make sense of itself?
Yes, it's headed currently by a retired diplomat from the Indian Foreign Service, whose I think he was India's ambassador to Japan. He retired from there and he became the Director General of that particular institution. So essentially, being a government think tank, the head of that institution is a former or a retired foreign affairs or maybe a military person. But in this case, it is a retired diplomat. And then under that particular Director General, then there are this hierarchy of senior research fellows, some interns. So they have got a range of senior people from the military. Especially, I realized that the people who I interacted with were generally from the Navy, Indian Navy. But also they had very young researchers, kind of early career. And in this particular session, they made it open, so some students from other universities also participated. So they keep it open when they are interacting with someone visiting this institute and have an interaction, so that you get different kinds of... They were also interested in what Australia thinks about India and what Australia's position is on the Indo-Pacific and other kinds of multilateral frameworks like Quad and so on and so forth. So the interest, they wanted to know from me as well, but my aim was to get from them as much as possible.
So from their perspective and the general conversations that you had, what did you glean from their understanding of Australia's role in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I think not just IDSA, but I would talk generally because, as I said, I also met with other strategic thinkers and some of them policymakers as well, or at least they were former policymakers from the Navy and also from what they call Niti Aayog, which is the planning commission, former planning commission of India. So essentially, the message was that India-Australia relations are getting better, but there is a but there. There is sense of concerns or anxiety because in the past, what they were saying that Australia was a bit worried about India's ambition in the Indian Ocean, going back to the Cold War period. So the memory is still kind of, they come back to them because Australia heavily criticized India's role in the Indian Ocean, especially India's Navy, and kind of, India was trying to expand in the Indian Ocean, which was not of the national interest of Australia. That's one concern, kind of past. But more recently, what they were saying that in 2007, 2008, Australia, when Rudd became Prime Minister, all of a sudden, Australia withdrew from this Quad framework. So they were saying that, can we trust Australia? Because Australia is trying to get back into the Malabar exercise. You may remember, and the listener may know, that Australia did participate in 2007 Malabar exercise, and Singapore also was part of it. But now the Malabar exercise consists only of India, the United States, and Japan. And Australia has been trying to get in, but India has been, I won't say opposing, but questioning why we should include Australia. And at some stage, Australia asked, or the Australian government asked, can we get an observer status in the Malabar exercise? To which the answer was no, because they don't want to create a new category where countries can come to the Malabar exercise as an observer. But in the end, most of them, they agreed that eventually Australia will become part of the Malabar exercise. But the timing has to be right from the US perspective, from Japan's and India's perspective. Last time Australia asked to be part of it was right at the end of the Wuhan summit between Modi and Xi Jinping. And by including Australia or accepting Australia's request would have gone against the spirit of, kind of loosening up of India's relations with China. So the timing has to be right, but I get the sense that, yes, Australia will get into it eventually.
India is in a very interesting position because it has its own national security concerns against China and has national security concerns against Pakistan, which is a client state of China. It has arguably an ambition to play a key role in the Indo-Pacific. And yet it has to manage its relations with the United States at the same time. How do you think India's former non-aligned position serves it moving forward? Because, I mean, you said about the memories of the past, about Australia having shunned India during the Cold War. But, if you look at it from Canberra's perspective, we all believed that India was acting as a local surrogate for the Soviet Union at the time, because it was buying Soviet weaponry. And even though the Indian political elite was saying, no, we're neutral, we're not aligned, we don't want to be part of this whole international crisis, at the same time, we bought into the American alignment, effectively.
Well, we confused purchasing military hardware with buying into the ideology.
Yeah. I think you're right in terms of the Cold War. There were mutual suspicion of each other. Australia being an ally of the United States and India not formally an ally but kind of quasi-ally of the Soviet Union. So the suspicion was mutual, but that suspicion has gone. So there is a huge amount of goodwill, both in Australia and India, about each other.
See, I would immediately be concerned that even though we've passed potentially the Cold War problems, the fact that India is so heavily involved in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization could become a new problem of a similar kind of shape. That the idea that the closer the relationships are within the SCO, the harder it is for us to make sense of how to relate to India.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a very genuine question. But India's position, I mean, I'm not here kind of talking on behalf of the government, but the sense I got at the Raisina Dialogue, because the Foreign Minister of India, Jaishankar, he gave a very good presented a very good interactive session, in which he said that, India's relationship with China is one where India needs to find what he called equilibrium. And this equilibrium, I think he meant that, look, India does not anymore follow the non-aligned principles. What India essentially follows now, one could say that it's kind of multi-alignment, right? And this multi-alignment is about alignment with the US, as well as not abandoning its past close friend. And even today, Russia is an important partner for India. Because as we know that India imports a whole lot of arms from Russia. Now India imports more arms from the United States. So it's trying to find this kind of multi-alignment, how it works and whether it works in India's favor. It's a kind of an experiment which the Indian government is trying to do. At the same time, the China question is very important. Like Australia, India also depends on China for trade. And to a certain extent, for investment, because India is looking for more and more investment, and maybe China will be an important country for India to invest in India. At the same time, as David said, that John, you said about India and China having this border dispute, the question of Tibet, and all those kinds of, one of the Indian states, Arunachal Pradesh, part of it is claimed by China as its own territory. So these are very difficult questions for India, which India has to, navigate and negotiate. But so far, it seems to me that India is in a little bit different position vis-a-vis China if we compare that to Australia. I mean, the dependency of Australia on China is so great and so large. India does not depend on China that much, even economically. All right. So that's one difference. The other is there were concerns in India, as I could feel and sense, that Australia is too timid when it comes to China, and that's why they were saying that Japan's vision or the strategy of free and open Indo-Pacific, the Australian side does not endorse free and open. They talk about open, but not so much free. So I have gone through some of the statements made by the foreign minister and others in Australia. They're not talking about so much free, it's saying open Indo-Pacific. So FOAP as such that's Indian side story, that Australia doesn't accept that narrative because Australia is always thinking about China and what reaction China will have if Australia goes too close to India and some other countries.
So do you think that we've actually created a rod for our own back in that sense, from a foreign policy perspective, having moved too close or being too concerned with China?
Yeah, that's kind of perception in one country, which is a very significant country. And we know that now Australia is trying very hard to partner with India in a range of areas. Marie Spain, our foreign minister, was there in one of the sessions. And she apologized. She said, look, our prime minister could not come, and people know why he couldn't come. But she said that, look, he will come very soon, visit India very soon. Similarly, when the foreign minister of India was talking, there was a question from the floor about India-Australia relations. I was quite pleased and surprised as well that somebody was asking this question on a very specific bilateral relationship, to which the Indian foreign minister replied that yes, he will visit soonish, so it's not long. And why I think India-Australia relations are becoming important. One is economic. The Australian government has issued a new India economic strategy paper, 2018. The Indian side, for the first time, has also produced an India-Australia strategy paper. India has never produced a strategy paper for any country in the past. So this is quite remarkable. So they could see some economic potential between Australia and India. Energy is, for example, is a very big thing. India will need more and more energy as it grows. Also, mineral resources for India, and not to mention students from India. It seems to me there are about 100,000 students, or Indian students, studying in Australia already. I think that number is going to go up. And when that goes up, it means tourism increases, flourishes, parents coming here, relatives coming here, so all those kinds of things. India and Australia, whether we admit or don't, we are trying to find some kind of balance between China and India. So let's think of India as a balancer, not in the strict international relations IR terms, but balancer in terms of population mix, in terms of student mix, in terms of diversification of trade.
Yeah, to jump back a step, Purnendra, it's very much where you're making the point about multi-alignment. In our trip in October, we heard a lot of different phrases, but they all come down to exactly what you described here. You do what you need to do as a government to get along with your neighbours and distant countries. And Australia is very late to the multi-alignment table, if we understand the concept at all. The implications of this are that people have been talking about the economic slowdown in India.
Yes.
And I guess my question is, was it obvious, and are people worried? And what kind of solutions are they proposing to stimulate economic activity?
Well, it's obvious when you read the newspapers and you switch on television channels, but it's not obvious in a 5-star hotel in Delhi, where this conference was held, and not in a top 5-star hotel in Delhi, where a cup of coffee costs double the price what we pay here. So you don't see that economic downturn in those places.
You have to go outside and look for it.
You have to go outside, just outside of Delhi, you need to go and see. And talk to a taxi driver or someone who's a vendor on the street. You talk to them. So they're all complaining about inflation, especially in the prices of vegetables and fruit and pulses and grains. That's their livelihood. This is what sustains them.
Yeah.
So those things have become very expensive. And if you look at the macro of data, the Indian economy is not growing as much as it was in the 2014, 2017. So the growth has come down, and that is a big worry for the Indian government at the moment on the economic front. But I just want to touch on this issue of, since we were talking about Australia, one of the concerns for Australia and many other countries would be India's withdrawal, not withdrawal, but at least, kind of withdrawal from RCEP. Because the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which was supposed to have 16 members, 15 agreed, and India somehow at the last minute decided to say that, look, this doesn't suit our national interests. So that is a big concern from the Australian perspective as well as from the Japanese perspective. Again, there was a question from the floor on this issue, and the Foreign Minister of India said that we haven't closed our door on RCEP. So it's for the ball is in other countries' court. But I couldn't understand why the minister would say that the ball is in others' court. It's in India's court, in my view. But this is what the official position of India is on RCEP.
I'm wondering, Purnendra, you had a lot of higher-ups come to the Raisina Dialogue. What was the most senior of the Chinese delegation? I mean, who was actually there?
There were not many senior Chinese delegates. Mm-hmm. There were very senior delegates from countries like Iran. The foreign minister of Iran was there. Mm. The foreign minister of Russia was there.
Pakistan?
No, but there were the foreign minister of Maldives. Was there. The former, I think he's former foreign minister of Maldives, but the foreign minister of Bhutan was there.
So the neighbourhood was very well represented.
The neighbourhood was involved. Bangladesh withdrew at the last minute from the Raisina Dialogue. Perhaps the reason would have been, not officially stated, because of a new law which India has introduced called the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA. So they might be opposing this particular act, and as a result, they didn't think that it was reasonable for them to send their foreign minister to this particular dialogue. But the representation was from big and large states, from United States, Russia, to tiny island states of Maldives. So it was a good mix, but to answer your question, no, not many representation from China.
What do you think what sort of message does that send? I mean, if China is so important to India's future at a diplomatic and strategic level, surely the Chinese would have had it in their interest or their best interest to send the highest level delegation they possibly could to the Raisina Dialogue.
One would think so. Yeah. And I don't know the history because this was the 5th Raisina Dialogue. They started this dialogue in 2016, a couple of years after the Modi government came in power. And this Raisina Dialogue, the term Raisina comes from the seat of government in New Delhi. It was a little hill, and in early 20th century, when the British decided to move their capital from Calcutta, now Kolkata, to Delhi. So they found this place, this Raisina Hill, where they started building the Viceroy's residence.
Oh, okay.
So this Viceroy Palace, as it used to be called, is now India's President House. And on the two sides of that President House is the Secretariat, consisting of all the major ministries and the Prime Minister's office. So that's why they have taken this name Raisina Dialogue, which gives this meaning that this is about government thinking, strategy, diplomacy.
All the forms of power in one
place.
place.
Yeah.
To sort of jump back a step, I was just thinking about why maybe the Chinese don't send a senior delegation. And to me, it would seem that they ideally want to arrange bilateral relationships so that there's not a sort of unified world other than a common relationship with China. So other than being there to listen, I can't imagine they would want to be at Raisina and say anything very overt.
Is it also that perhaps their absence nullifies, takes power away from such diplomatic
Initiatives.
initiative, right? Yeah.
If we're not there, it can't be as
it
important.
makes it ineffective.
Yeah.
Well-meaning, but ineffective.
Look, I can't say for sure that there was absence of China.
But just not
Because
senior
I haven't
people.
seen the full list of, and as you know, in these kinds of places, you have got plenary and breakout sessions,
Yeah.
and there were 160 names. Maybe I didn't digest all those names, but there might be some representation from China. But certainly it was not at a higher level where you had the former foreign ministers of 7 countries sharing the platform, or EU represented by big countries of Europe.
Yep.
I didn't come across any Chinese representation. Even there were very senior naval officers in one of the sessions where you had representation from Japan, from Australia, from New Zealand, and of course from India. But I didn't see any representation from China. The other thing I don't know, perhaps you know that China itself has quite a large number of such forums. Chinese have got, like for economic matters, they have Boao Forum, which happens every year. Then they have got Xiangshan Forum, which is about military, defense, security forum. And then they have got Beijing Forum. So they
bring people to them. They don't really need to send senior people.
You're listening to Strategicon. Now for this episode's musical interlude, courtesy of Mum Thinks Blue, with their track Broken Fence.
Together in the shower, talk about our dreams.
Broken Fence by Mum Thinks Blue. In this episode of Strategicon, we've been talking to Professor Purnendra Jain about his recent trip to India for the Raisina Dialogue. Some of his research and learning will inform the report that SIA has to produce for their research grant with the Department of Defence.
Just something else too. Because of India's sort of history of the non-aligned, being part of the non-aligned movement, is it very much a case that this would be one of the few international meetings left where the residual non-aligned countries can get together and speak in a fairly open forum?
Yeah, maybe that's a point. I never thought about it.
I hadn't until now either, sorry. If it's a question without notice, Purnendra, it just seemed interesting.
Yeah. I did see a huge number of participation from Africa, but there were some. It was not absent. But I think it's more about India now as an emerging power or as a power that matters to the world and to the region. India wants to showcase through this particular forum what it is all about and how, and also it's a window for Indian policymakers to bring people from different countries and listen to them, what they are thinking about India. Now I give you an example. The Russian foreign minister was there. And he very clearly said that why do we have this concept of Indo-Pacific? In his view, it is anti-China and containment of China. So at least people are listening that the Russians don't like this idea of Indo-Pacific. It doesn't mean that India will change its stance or Australia will change its stance, but we know that the Russians think that this is kind of containment of China.
What was he proposing instead, or he didn't?
He didn't. He said, we have got Asia-Pacific. Okay. Why do we have Indo-Pacific, right? But to that, I think the current Foreign Secretary of India, he said that he didn't refer to the Russian Foreign Minister, but he did say that in Asia-Pacific, he said, is a colonial concept.
Also a continental power concept rather than a maritime power concept.
Yeah.
So to me, it's both those things are important, aren't they?
Yeah. And also Asia-Pacific, it never included India, right? So to come to India and criticize Indo-Pacific is quite remarkable.
A bit of a slap.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. So I think it was a good platform to exchange ideas and views. Even the foreign minister of India said a number of things which, there were commentaries or there were murmurs in the corridor about what the Indian foreign minister was saying. Is it really that's true? He was saying that India is not a disruptor. India is a decider. And they were saying, what happens to RCEP? How are you are a disruptor. You are not a decider. So there were murmurs in the corridors, which one could hear, which I thought was very, very interesting. The Iranian foreign minister was there, criticizing the US. And of course, he felt sorry about what happened with the aircraft. But he was out there criticizing the US and he said, Iran is not going to negotiate with the US on their terms. Right.
Yeah. So tell me, with regard to the United States, we spoke about China and why they didn't send senior level delegation to the Raisina conference. Who did the Americans throw into the mix?
The United States, there were several of them, but in one of these sessions, the deputy head of the National Security NSS, what do you call National Strategy Council or something?
NSC.
Yeah. He was there.
Mm-hmm. So fairly senior.
In the same panel as Maurice Payne was. Right. And you could see the difference in their tones in terms of Indo-Pacific. Yep. While this American senior official was very clearly articulated that how Indo-Pacific is a concept which the Trump administration has adopted, while Maurice Payne said, yes, this is important, this is about democracy, this is about maritime security. But I didn't see the same kind of passion from Australia as we saw. It's kind of maybe language and the way Americans sometimes present themselves.
But that signalling can be very important.
Yeah.
Because if the big person signals commitment, that matters.
Yeah.
If the small player who isn't trusted signals, lukewarm cup of weak tea, it's not very
I
persuasive.
think it's a style and messaging, the way
Yeah.
you are styled and you present things. But I could see that how passionate he was about this Indo-Pacific and talking about the role of India in particular in this particular concept.
What's interesting is if we go back to talking about Australia and its role in the region and how India kind of took umbrage and has kept us out of the Malabar Maritime Exercise. I recall in late 2018 when I went across to India for the MAST Asia Summit. And there we had, pretty senior military delegations from around the region. And we had a retired Indian Commodore, a former submariner, if I remember correctly. And I decided to ask the question about the quadrilateral dialogue and, what India thought about it. My God, the hostility that I got from that guy for asking that question.
But you wonder if it was asking it as an Australian, like, why would you ask when you're the ones that pulled the pin?
Well, I mean, that
might have
just
been
an interested observer.
But again, the media identifying as Australian, it's like, so you want back in again.
Yeah.
So you can maybe explain, Purnendra's experience helps us understand maybe why you got that response.
But then again, when I went to Japan last year and, we were in front of, again, the MAST Asia crowd, we had a Japanese audience. It was a totally different sort of feel and a totally different vibe. Obviously, the Japanese are very clear about, the dangers that they face. They're very clearly focused on North Korea and China. That's it, for them.
Yeah.
And there was no ambivalence about our kind of alliance relationship, with Tokyo. So, that was not a problem.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how maybe our very close ties to the United States has prevented India or prevented Australia from being able to relate to India. It's interesting, as David was saying earlier, when we were in Canberra, we were doing all the research for the GP grant, and we found that many of the countries that we've interviewed have got this balancing act quite neatly solved and sorted.
We're far better at it than we are.
And yet we're so anxious about China.
All of it.
And we're so anxious about China because we're still deeply in the shadow of the United States. And so we're almost incapable of thinking ourselves as a sovereign power in the Indo-Pacific. We are an alliance partner of the United States. And so long as the political elite keeps on peddling that particular line, whether that's good or bad, it means that other countries take a view on where Australia stands. And that could be bad.
Sorry, Matt, I want to qualify that line. We're a junior alliance partner with the United States.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes India so different. Is India is saying we will be an alliance partner with you, not a junior partner. Is that a fair distinction?
Well,
Purnendra?
actually, no one is using the term alliance with the United States in India. I mean, they are saying that we are working closely with the United States, but no one is saying that India.
So it's part of maintaining this language of being able to get along with everyone in the way you need to get a good outcome for your country.
I mean, one of the reasons that India and Australia, they are becoming closer is the United States. As India's relations with the US have become closer and stronger, that has given incentive for politicians in Canberra to seek partnership with India because they see that there is kind of convergence of interests and ideas and institutions. And that's why they find India very attractive. But from the Indian side, they find Australia kind of not following its policy in a consistent manner. So there are some questions and concerns in Delhi or in India about Australia's position. But this Australia's position, they're not questioning about its relations with the US, but they're questioning Australia's relationship with China.
Well, isn't that also because, as David said, we're a junior partner, but we're also not a great power. So, India considers itself a great power, fighting among other great powers, the United States and China, the EU, if you want to use that as a supranational entity of sorts. So they believe that they are the first among equals. We're not even getting table scraps here. We're Australia.
Yeah, I think it's a bit unfair to compare India with Australia in that regard. We know who we are and how big we are or how middle power we are.
No, I don't think we do know. I think we think we're a middle power and that's bigger than we are.
Yeah.
Whereas India knows it's a big power.
India knows it's big, but India has got its own challenges and problems, and they are not easy to deal with. The China-India relationship is quite complex, and in the middle comes Pakistan, which makes the position very, very. I mean, for BRI, for example, India has been consistently opposed to this idea. Because one of the projects of BRI goes to Pakistan.
Corridor.
So it's the question of sovereignty, which India has been consistently raising. And only 2 years ago, actually, India and China, they had a standoff on the border around Bhutan. So it was a long standoff for more than 70 days. So it's not easy for India and China. So they haven't sorted out their border issues. Nothing is sorted out.
It may not be easy, but they have a clearer sense of identity. Just to jump into something historical, if we looked at really Australian-Japanese relations really only became what they are as a consequence of American decisions at the end of World War II, we're going to build a new world where there's going to be a sense of justice and good behaviour, whether you were vanquished or a victor. And it seems that Australia and Japan were a way to make that point clear to the world. In a sense, are we going to have to rely on the relationship developing between the US and India to work out how we're going to relate with India?
I think that seems to be the case, that Australia was very closely following what was happening between India and the US. And as soon as the relationship began to improve, and once this nuclear agreement was signed between India and the US, I think in Canberra, politicians began to think how we can also deal with India. But it took quite a while for the Australian government to come to a nuclear agreement in terms of exporting uranium to India. So I think it was 4 or 5 years after the nuclear deal with the United States. It took a while. So the Indian side sees a bit of hesitancy in Canberra, and that's their concern. And that concern was kind of reinforced with Australia withdrawing from the Quad in 2008. So they are reluctant to bring Australia. And they're also concerned, they're saying that, look, this is a huge exercise and it needs your Navy support. There are, I don't know how many thousands of naval personnel are involved, and this is high sea exercise. So it's a lot of commitment, and they were concerned whether Australia will have that kind of commitment to this Malabar exercise.
Returning to the thorny issue of Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is part of the BRI, as you said, and I'm wondering whether at the Raisina Dialogue there was any talk about Pakistan in terms of how it affects India's national security, its position in the Indo-Pacific, because obviously Pakistan, being such a national security threat, draws a lot of India's attention, obviously to the point where it almost seems like India can't really focus on being a big power in the Indo-Pacific because it's got this huge threat right next door, which is effectively now being supported by the Chinese.
There might have been, because as you said, I didn't go to all the sessions because there were some parallel sessions going on. There were some sessions by invitation only. And where they had dinner or, so I didn't go to those sessions. So what they discussed there, I don't know. But in all the plenary sessions which I attended, I don't think there was any direct reference to Pakistan, but certainly when they were talking about Indo-Pacific, when they were talking about terrorism, when they were talking about origin of terrorism, certainly the implied literature or implied meaning was that, Pakistan, we need to deal with Pakistan, but it didn't come I don't think these forums will have.
It's not necessary
to bring these things so directly. I was quite surprised the way the Russian foreign minister talked about Indo-Pacific. He
Well,
said
actually,
it was a
it's-
divisive concept. It was
Yeah.
a divisive concept. Why do you have a divisive concept?
Well, it's funny because the Russians themselves have a divisive concept, something
Yeah.
called Eurasia. Russia is a Eurasian country. Well, what the hell does that mean?
It's wherever they want to push the borders to.
Well, exactly right. And you could say that it's a contrivance to hive the Russian territory well and truly within the Russian border because they're so worried about China's encroachments into Siberia, which is causing them all kinds of existential problems at the moment. Yeah.
So, I mean, he had a platform and he said what he thought.
Very eloquently, no doubt.
Yep. Yep. And with much conviction.
Yes.
Yeah, he was given just by himself. He was just talking on as a kind of not keynote, but yes, he had
The major
quite a
speaker
bit
in a
of time,
session.
major speech.
Yeah.
I would like to say that Australia missed a great opportunity this time because Modi had invited Scott Morrison to visit India, and as part of that visit, Morrison was going to give a keynote speech at the Raisina Dialogue. It would have been nice to hear what he had to say and reactions from the floor and from the Indian side. So it was a missed opportunity, but we understand why he couldn't go.
Yeah, bushfire crisis.
I mean, in the past 2 years ago, they had Israeli Prime Minister talking about what Israel's view was on world politics, where he didn't mince words, and he said that he appreciates soft power, but he loves hard power.
Very diplomatic of Benjamin.
Last year they had, I think, Norwegian Prime Minister.
We said how much they love soft power and they really don't want to do hard power.
That's right. She was just talking about, what Norway was doing in terms of, climate change and mostly soft power, right? Not so much.
In terms of semi-contentious issues, okay, Pakistan wasn't discussed. How much discussion was there of Afghanistan?
Well, the Afghanistan former president was there, Karzai.
Okay.
So, and he has been a regular to the Raisina Dialogue.
Interesting.
So he has been, I think he has been coming almost every year. He was talking about the situation, and, his main point was that we are trying to achieve peace in Afghanistan. And that's our ultimate goal. And being in New Delhi, he was emphasizing or focusing more on Afghanistan relations with India and how India is critical to Afghanistan. But I didn't think he talked much about Pakistan in that context.
So it really was what India and
it's-
Afghanistan can do to stabilize Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
that
think
would have irritated Islamabad.
Yeah,
That would have been fantastic to hear.
He was very diplomatic
Would
and
have
he
been-
knew what he's a very seasoned politician.
Yeah.
He knows what he was talking and where he should say what. Privately they might have talked. But interestingly, these forums are also very good because all these leaders, then they meet with senior leaders on a bilateral basis. I know Marie Spain had a meeting with the foreign minister of India. Also, she had a meeting with the Iranian foreign minister.
Oh, that's interesting.
As you know, one academic from Melbourne Uni
course.
is being
Yes,
held
yeah.
in prison. So I'm sure she must have raised that issue with him privately.
Yep.
So I think these forums also provide other kinds of interaction
Back
which you
channels.
can't do, if you are not attending these kinds of forums. So this has got its purpose. And I was very impressed by this forum. I was fortunate. And thanks to the Department of Defense here, we had some money to travel.
To be able to send you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which is awesome.
I'm just wondering, the project that we're on is looking at power relationships among the countries of the Indo-Pacific, from the very large to the medium to the very small. In terms of, you've got the small microstates of the Indian Ocean, you've got places like Sri Lanka. What was the sense that you got from, they represented themselves well at the Raisina Dialogue, but is it really a matter of India cracking the whip and the smaller states just kind of bending to India's will? Or is it a case of that these smaller countries can and do act, on their own sovereign accord?
Well, India's official position would be that they are independent sovereign states. But if you think about some of the neighbors of India, for example, the Maldives, certainly any political disturbances in the Maldives disturb India as well. So there was a period of instability in the Maldives, but fortunately now there is a democratic government. To a certain extent, the foreign minister was saying that how grateful he was to India for the support which India gave, maybe indirectly, not so much directly. So India would not like to meddle with domestic matters of small little countries, but when it comes to support where India can give, they are willing to do that. Again, there was a question from the floor about India's aid, foreign aid to smaller countries. So the foreign minister Jaishankar again said that, we are giving a quite sizable amount now. And he also said that it's not just our neighborhood, but he counted some of the African states. And he said he was going to some of them because India has funded or given loans to those countries to build bridges and to build other kinds of infrastructure projects.
Is that tied aid, or is that sort of like, aid that has no expectation?
No, it is a line of credit. So actually this is kind of loan given to those countries on a very generous term or very generous terms.
Right. Okay.
So it might be that it's Indian money, but then it ends up being a Chinese company that builds it.
Well, that could be.
So
I don't know to what extent they are monitoring, but only recently I learned that Japan is funding a coal power or coal-generated power project in Vietnam, and the environment minister of Japan found out that this project is going to go to a Chinese and to an American company. So he is questioning his own government as to why we have given this so much. First, why do we need to support a coal project?
Yes.
One. And two, even if we support, it's a clean coal project or modern coal project, why are we using our money to give this contract to China or to US? But once you give loan, if it is not tied, then it's for the recipient to decide where they want to go. They go for the cheapest.
Oh, obviously.
I mean, we know about
economic necessity.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, well, Purnendra, that's close to a wrap. But before we go, can I ask, what was your main takeaway from the Raisina Dialogue?
Well, the main takeaways would be that the world is a highly disrupted place. Mm-hmm. And that came out very clearly in the first session where you had 7 former foreign ministers around the world talking. And this disruption is not only about China's assertiveness, military power, but also about United States or America first, and Donald Trump's unilateral approach. Apart from that, they also talked about disruption in terms of climate change, environmental issues, terrorism. So all these points, they said that, there are serious challenges and we need to do something about these challenges. You cannot change something, but you can change other things. So how to tackle this highly disrupted world, which is disrupted economically, politically, militarily, and also in terms of environment and climate change.
Okay.
So the only certainty is it's not business as usual.
Yes, that's true. That's the message which came through very, very clearly. But I don't think anyone offered solutions as to what we can do. I mean, they were saying cooperation and partnership, but in actual terms, how these things are going to be operational is hard. So it will be more bilateral.
That's what happened in the meetings outside of the conference.
Trilateral, bilateral, same tools of diplomacy which need to be employed.
Okay, well, gentlemen, that's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us on Strategic On one more time, Purnendra.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn and Spotify, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Also, if you would like to support Strategicon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategicon listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.
Oscast. 2022 was Toys for Tots' 75th anniversary and also their record-breaking year, distributing over 24 million toys to nearly 10 million less fortunate children. Toys for Tots is not just a Christmas time charity, they're a year-round force for good. Thanks to their supporters, Toys for Tots is able to support children in need beyond Christmas time through their year-round programs. You can make a difference today. Learn more about their year-round force for good at toysfortots.org.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.